Hello, and welcome to Roll for Resilience, a podcast with the mission to explore how we can use role-playing games like D&D and Final Fantasy as tools to facilitate healing and personal growth. I am your host, Effector of Change. My pronouns are he, they. I am a lifelong gamer and a licensed clinical social worker. On this episode of the podcast, I'll be introducing you to what I do in my day job, EMDR therapy. This talk was part of a mental health awareness raid train on Twitch organized by Ari is Here. So I'm going to be talking about EMDR therapy today. That is what I do, y'all. I am an EMDR therapist in my IRL day job. I am a therapist by day and a warrior of light by stream. So yes, I am in fact a gamer and a licensed mental health professional. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I have a private practice that I operate in upstate New York, and I am primarily an EMDR therapist. So that is my favorite modality. So let's talk. What the hell is EMDR therapy? So let me introduce you to the wonderful, amazing, brilliant Francine Shapiro. Francine Shapiro unfortunately passed away in 2019, so I did not get a chance to meet her, but the mentor that I work with who's been doing EMDR therapy since probably the 90s, I think she got trained in 1990, was closely trained and aligned with Francine Shapiro, so I'm very blessed to have that secondhand knowledge to be able to kind of absorb that through osmosis. And let me read you a little chapter, a little story that Francine shares in her book. So it's called The Chance Discovery. Although the role of eye movement had been well documented in connection with higher cognitive processes and cortical function, and indeed had previously been identified as correlated with a shift in cognitive content, its use in EMDR therapy is based on a chance observation I made in the spring of 1987. While walking one day, I noticed that some disturbing thoughts I was having suddenly disappeared. I also noticed that when I brought these thoughts back to mind, they were not as upsetting or as valid as before. Previous experience had taught me that disturbing thoughts generally have a certain loop to them. That is, they tend to play themselves over and over until one consciously does something to stop or change them. What caught my attention that day was that my disturbing thoughts were disappearing and changing without any conscious effort. Fascinated, I started to pay very close attention to what was going on. I noticed that when disturbing thoughts came into my mind, my eyes spontaneously started moving very rapidly back and forth in an upward diagonal. Again, the thoughts disappeared, and then I brought them back to my mind. Their negative charge was greatly reduced. At that point, I started making the eye movements deliberately while concentrating on a variety of disturbing thoughts and memories, and I found that these thoughts also disappeared and lost their charge. My interest grew as I began to see the potential benefits of this effect. And so this story that Francine is sharing in 1987, she was in grad school. She was a graduate student working on her clinical psychology degree. A few days later, I started to try it out with some other people, friends, colleagues, participants in the psychology workshops I was attending. They all had a wide range of non-pathological complaints, and like the rest of the population, had a varying amounts of psychotherapy. When I asked, "What do you want to work on?" people brought up disturbing memories, beliefs, and present situations, with complaints ranging from early childhood humiliations to present-day work frustrations. Then, I showed them how I moved my eyes rapidly back and forth. I asked them to duplicate those eye movements while simultaneously holding their problems in mind. The first thing I discovered was that most people do not have the muscle control to continue the eye movement for any length of time. Still determined to investigate, I asked them to follow my fingers with their eyes as I moved my hand back and forth until their eye movements duplicated the speed and direction that I had used that day. So we're talking about an upward diagonal in the park. This worked much better. However, the next thing I discovered was that people would start feeling better, but would then get stuck in the disturbing material. To overcome this difficulty, I tried different kinds of eye movements, faster, slower, different directions, and asked people to concentrate on a variety of different things, different aspects of the memory, the way it made them feel. As we proceeded, I began to learn which strategies were most likely to get positive and complete results. In addition, I started to find standard ways of opening and closing the sessions that seemed to contribute to positive effects. In short, by working with some 70 people over the course of about 6 months, I developed a standard procedure that consistently succeeded in alleviating their complaints. Because my primary focus was on reducing anxiety, as that had been my own experience with the eye movements, and my primary modality at that time was behavioral, I called this procedure eye movement desensitization. So the initial protocols of EMDR therapy were called EMD. EMD is what her original protocol was designed to do and treat. And I use EMD as an EMDR therapist for certain situations. It's usually around what I would say is a present trigger. So when someone goes through an awful experience, we have a 3-month window where we can do something about that so it doesn't become hard-coded as a trauma memory. If it goes past that, you have to change what kinds of protocols you are utilizing with somebody. But if there's something fresh, if something new has happened, EMD is a great protocol to get that distress level down, to process it through, and just give somebody what they need to heal. I've done a lot of work with first responders, for example. In my area, there was a big shooting that had happened. And so I got some referrals of people who were around that or near that. You know, that's a lot of like anxiety and distress and stuff. And so EMD is a perfect protocol to be able to give someone first aid, so that whatever they experience, whatever they went through, doesn't have to manifest into PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They can chew through it utilizing those protocols. It's really amazing. I am a member of the International Association of the EMDR International Association, EMDRIA, but we have EMDR Europe as well. They are a separate organization. And some of the research that comes out of that group is so different than the research we have in the States. They're really innovative. They're really creative. I think part of it is when Francine Shapiro continued her journey into creating EMDR therapy, she created the EMDR Institute. So the EMDR Institute kind of had a chokehold on what procedures we use, what things that we did, ways that we utilize strategies. And so a lot of American innovation really had to follow line with that. Whereas EMDR Europe, they just were kind of like, we're going to do whatever we want. One of the groups in India has a challenge in terms of access to mental health care. A lot of folks there aren't necessarily trusting medical professionals like psychotherapists or psychiatrists. They don't just have enough people trained to get people what they want. And so what they did is they trained matron figures, you know, the moms, the grannies, the aunties, right? They trained matron figures in the basic protocols of EMDR therapy. And so they've got those women doing the healing work, getting people what they need. It's really fascinating to hear the innovations that come from EMDR Europe. It's really cool. EMDR, right? It's a lot of letters. Why are they there? It gets confusing. So, like I said, the original design, it was an anxiety treatment protocol. And I use EMD sometimes when I'm treating folks, but it's not quite enough. It's not quite enough to get people what they need to actually solidify some treatment gains and to really genuinely heal. And so there was a shift in the branding, if you will, in 1990. She continued to do her observations. And I think one of the more brilliant things that she decided to do, she was like, we need to do research. We need to make sure that we have protocols, that we standardize the protocols, that we make sure people are doing the protocol correctly. And then we need to be able to correlate that with clinical trials. And so I believe EMDR therapy has had about 26 randomized controlled trials to demonstrate its effectiveness at treating PTSD. And then there's a few other research studies on other conditions like depression, bipolar, things like that. But she was really insistent that that was an important part of the design. And so in 1990, there was that big shift. There was that big shift where we went from EMD to EMDR. So the R in EMDR therapy stands for reprocessing. So the I movement, right? She talked about that in her little chance discovery, is we kind of like, well, what is that? What's going on there? Desensitization, right, is reducing the anxiety or the distress related to a traumatic memory. And then the reprocessing, which is a big part of trauma therapy, is changing the meaning, changing the context. When we go through an event that's really challenging, that is emotional, it impacts our belief system. It impacts how we see ourselves. It impacts the world around us. It impacts how we see other people, right? And so through the reprocessing, we can change that lens. So instead of thinking, I'm not enough, which is a negative cognition I hear often in my work, as well as just in my personal life and what I see on Twitch, I'm not enough, right? That can be such a toxic belief, and that can impact so many decisions. It can impact our relationship, our jobs, our whole world. And to let that go, to just believe I am enough, is huge. I don't want to put down my colleagues, because we're all in a different place in our journey. And we all have different expertise and experience. I guess one of the things I can say is I can't be everyone's therapist. There are some people that I'm going to jive with really well, and we're going to connect, and you're going to see the healing happen. And then there are other people, it's just not going to work. It's just not going to happen. And I don't think it's a failing of me as a professional. If there are people that I can't work with or it's not going well, I just kind of accept, I'm going to work with the people that I know I can. But not every therapist is going to be compatible with us. It's just how humans work. I kind of think about when you're finding a therapist, it's a little like dating, in the sense that you got to try it out. You got to get the vibes. And if it isn't it, go find someone else. If you've been working with the same therapist for a period of time, let's say, 6 months, a year, 2 years, if you're, doing long-term therapy with somebody, and you're not making any more gains, like they helped, they got you somewhere, but you're not really moving forward, you're not continuing to gain, you might want to consider trying someone else. There's only so much every therapist can do. I do get a lot of people who come into my practice because I'm pretty clearly marketing myself as someone who is an EMDR therapist. That's what I do. And so some people will come in and they'll say, hey, AOC, I tried that EMDR stuff and it didn't work for me. I don't like it. Or, I tried it before and it didn't help, right? I hear that often in my practice. And I think part of the challenge, this is no tea or no shade to Francine, but in the work that she was doing, when she developed her protocols, I'm assuming a lot of the people that were in those trials were very privileged people. They were wealthy people. They were people who had resources. They were people who had family supports. They weren't the everyday Joe Schmo people. And I treat the everyday Joe Schmo people. That's the people I work with the most. I don't work with a lot of people with privilege. I take insurance in my practice. I think it's important. I have a bit of a sliding scale. I have some people that pay me a much smaller amount in my caseload when, in private practice, because I think it's important and it is ethical to make sure that I do what I can to support as many people as I can in a way that's accessible and affordable to them. Not every therapist is like that. Not every therapist will even take insurance. It's hard out there. I know. Yeah, some people won't mesh with their therapist, and that's okay. It just is what it is. Privilege, right? So a lot of the people that, EMDR therapy was designed to treat are people with a lot of privilege. And that's part of, what we learn about when we get trained as EMDR therapists, is that there are conditions. There are conditions that we need to help our clients have in order for the protocol to work, in order for people to get the treatment gains they desire, to have the contentment of life that they want. And not having adequate housing, for sure, that's going to be challenging to process your trauma. If you are in a domestic violence situation, an unhealthy, toxic dynamic, it's going to be hard to go back and treat your trauma. If you don't have health care, if you don't have some of those basic needs of security as a human being, it's going to be real challenging to try to go back and heal the unhealed stuff. And so I think a lot of therapists, I don't want to say a lot of therapists, but some therapists, I will say, it's a challenge for them. You know, if they don't have that experience themselves of, you know, being disadvantaged, of being marginalized, they may not have it. And so my suggestion, try to find a therapist who talks about marginalization on their materials, on their website, someone who maybe gets a little of that experience. You might notice something different in the care. Momo says it can take time. Facts. That's the exhausting thing about it. You have to advocate for yourself. I know. Even with medical care, it's not even just mental health care. Even with medical care, I have so many people that meet their doctors and the doctors don't believe them. Oh, well, you just need to lose weight. Oh, I think it's just psychosomatic. I don't think anything's going. It's terrible. The gatekeeping in the field, whether it's physical or mental, it's awful. Momo says, I got lucky. My first counselor was the most amazing person in the world and changed my life. That makes my heart happy, Momo. That's kind of part of my journey. You don't usually talk about this stuff, but I'll share it with you guys because it's the mental health rage train. Why not? So when I was growing up, I didn't come from a family that was outright homophobic. I mean, there were some comments, there were some things that people would say, but for the most part, my family was pretty chill. But I internalized homophobia, I internalized fear and shame, and I was worried about coming out. So I grew up with my grandma as my main parent. Both my parents are alive, they're around, but they didn't raise me. My grandmother did. And so when I was about to turn 16, trigger warning, we're going to talk a little bit about grief and loss. So if that's something you're not vibing with, feel free to lurk. Just going to give you that heads up. When I was about to turn 16, she died. She passed away. She had cancer, and it was devastating. It was an awful experience for me to go through that. I just felt really alone. I felt really disconnected. There was nobody there. And I was learning about online journaling at the time. This is the day of LiveJournal, if y'all remember LiveJournal. And so there was a memorial service for my grandmother, and I had taken a bunch of pictures, and I posted all the pictures on a journal website like LiveJournal. And it was great. And I sent that link to people because, you know, I thought it was important to share. And then I had another account where I had been putting like my stuff about like my mental health. I wasn't doing great. I was putting stuff in there about my sexuality and like just trying to come to terms with that. And I had some friends at school that I was sharing that with, because after my grandma died, there was a period of about a month that I wasn't in school to try to deal with that situation. And so that's how I was trying to communicate, as I was putting things in the blog, and they were linked and I had no idea. And so I was staying with my aunt because there was this awful custody battle that I had to go through when I was 15, 16. So I was walking around, I was at my aunt's house, and I saw she had the blog pulled up, not the one of the pictures, but the one about my sexuality. And I had like dumped some trauma stuff about family and like my anger and resentment that every 16-year-old has. And so like, that was mad awkward. So like, I didn't have that outright homophobia experience in my family, but it was a lot to go through. It was a lot to deal with. And I didn't have a queer person that I could look up to. There was no one in my family I could talk to about it. I didn't have anyone at school I really knew. I mean, I knew a couple out kids. I knew a lot of closeted kids, but I didn't really have a mentor. I didn't have a person. And then I go to community college and I join gay club and I get an advisor. He's a career counselor, but he also had the role of being like a regular counselor as well, kind of like a guidance counselor. And he was the advisor for the club, and he was gay, and he was amazing. He was so sweet. he was such an amazing guy. And at that point, I just had decided, I'm like, I want to be that. I want to be that person for somebody someday. And I've been that person for hundreds, if not thousands, at this point of my career, which is kind of cool. But that's how I got started in the field is, I wanted to be that person. I wanted to be there with somebody. I wanted to be able to pull someone out of where I was because I needed that. And I didn't have it. And I think the added layers of poverty made it really challenging to overcome that. I did not have the conditions at 16 to heal. Let me tell you, they tried to put me in therapy. No. I was so angry. I was so mad. It was not going to work for me. Bubble says, yeah, it's true. I mean, my first therapist was amazing, but she doesn't work with adults. And I was so sad about that. Yeah, that transition is hard. That transition is really hard, but it's such an important, healthy thing to be able to have a healthy goodbye. So I get it. It's painful, but at least you got to have that gift of what it's like to have a healthy goodbye. That's really important. Mom says some counselors have biases about certain conditions and refuse to treat them. I don't treat that. I don't have to deal with it. And I was like, wow, thanks. You're telling me that I'm unwanted. I've gotten that on the medical side for conditions that do affect adults is frustrating. On the counseling side is different because some people specialize just with kids. Yeah, working with children and youth is a separate skill set. I work with adults. I do not work with kids. I just don't have the training or the experience to do it because it's different kind of work. The brain is different at that age. What I do has to be adapted differently. You can do EMDR therapy with children. I have colleagues that do EMDR therapy with kids. I think it's so cool, but I don't have that training. I don't have that expertise. My expertise is actually in working with complex trauma, complex PTSD. I do a lot of work with treating what's called dissociation. And that stuff cannot be treated with the standard EMDR therapy protocol. I have to make a lot of modifications in the work that I do compared to what you're going to find in this manual, because this does not work for that. This does not work. And if you're somebody who has complex history, more complex history means more complex treatment. And so I forget who was talking about doing EMDR therapy. It's quite possible that the therapist you were working with did not have the training or expertise in working with complex trauma. I didn't have that when I got trained. The standard protocol, basic training I got was very by the book. We followed this textbook. We learned it in and out. And this is what we did. I had a workbook that I had to do, but the basic training just didn't cover those specialty populations. Working with kids is a specialty population. Working with veterans is a specialty population. Working with addictive behavior is a specialty population. So you've got the basics, but then you need to get that consultation as a psychotherapist who's trained in EMDR therapy. You need to meet with somebody who works with the population you're going to serve, that you want to work with, because the basics of EMDR therapy are not going to cover what you need. And so unfortunately, there are a lot of people who got trained a long time ago and don't follow up on the continuing education and the supervision. Also, I use my 20-year-old live journal. I love that, Bobo. That's so cool. I miss live journal. Although journaling is really tough, man. On some ways, it can be a really useful therapy skill to know how to journal and to use it. But I also will say it can be a very dangerous path to take. Journaling, in some ways, where I've seen it gone awry, is where we expose ourselves to material that's way outside the window of what we can tolerate. And we just end up spinning our wheels and reliving and needing to defend against that material. And so doing the bleh of exploding all of our stuff, if it causes that distress loop, it's not useful. I find that when I assign journaling as therapy homework, if you will, and I don't really assign a lot of homework. That's another cool benefit, by the way, of EMDR therapy. There's very little homework. If you've ever done anything like DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of these other modalities, there's a lot of homework, but EMDR therapy doesn't require. Another thing that's really interesting about the development of EMDR therapy, psychology as a field is dominated by men. In fact, I think the next few slides that I have, look at these men. Look at these men. Look at all these men, right? You got these white freaking men who are, in our history of psychology. And no offense to the white men, I am one of you. But look at them all. They're all white. Francine Shapiro is a woman. EMDR therapy is a woman-created therapy, which I think is amazing. It's another reason why I'm a big fan of DBT. Dialectic behavior therapy is also another therapy created by a woman, Marsha Linehan. So the homework in EMDR therapy, the number one thing that I tell my clients when they walk in the door is I want you to do whatever you can to stay out of disturbance. That's it. Whatever skill, whatever strategy, whatever you need to do between our sessions to stay out of that disturbance, that's all I want you to do. When the stuff comes up, when you need to work through it, bring that to therapy. We will work on it together in the different ways that we do. How? Well, we teach those skills, Loverish. We teach those skills in therapy. That's not even possible. Yes, it is. It's so possible. It's so possible. So that's what we do a lot of work in the early stages in EMDR therapy of stabilization. Teaching people different strategies that they can utilize that help them to cope. Does doing the eye movement ever give people motion sickness? It can, depending on the situation. So when you're getting set up in the beginning of EMDR therapy, so let's talk about the eye movements. So a lot of people, when they hear about EMDR therapy, that's like the first thought that they go to, is that EMDR therapy is all about the eye movements. And as a clinician who is specially trained to treat complex PTSD and dissociation, I can tell you there's a lot of time I'm not doing any of that. Francine Shapiro, in all of her wisdom, she really was convinced that there was something about the movement of the eyes from the left to the right that was an essential component of what was underlying the theory of what was helping EMDR therapy do the effects that it does. But neuroscience, remember, this protocol was originally developed in 1987, and then in 1990 it was further refined, and it hasn't changed a lot since 1990. There are specialty protocols that other people have adapted and developed, but in terms of the very basic protocol, it hasn't changed since the 90s. It's pretty much the same thing. Think about neuroscience research. There's been a lot of neuroscience research that we've had since 1990. That was, oh God, I don't even want to do the math. I'm going to do it. 2024 minus 1990. 34 years ago. That's 34 years ago. So 34 years ago is when this was developed, right? But neuroscience has taken off. It has taken off. We've learned so much about the brain and how it operates and how it works. There's still a lot of mystery. There's still a lot of things we're trying to figure out. And I am not a neuroscience expert, so I can't really give you a lot of details on that stuff. But I can say that the research has not lined up with her theory about the eye movements. It really hasn't. So when I'm introducing some of these skills to people, because, we do eye movements in my work with folks, is that I teach not eye movements. I teach what's called dual awareness. So for EMDR therapy to work, right, to be able to get into a place where the brain can have the conditions where it can reprocess, we have to have one foot planted in the past of whatever the memory is that's leading to the challenge in the present, and then have our other foot, you can't see my hands, the other foot planted firmly here in the present, right? And it's through that dual awareness of the past and present, that's where the brain connection comes in. That's where the brain processes the information. Because usually what happens is when a memory comes flooding and we get reminded of an old experience, we get sucked into it. The analogy that I like to use, or the metaphor that I like to use, is imagine you're in a theater, right? So you've got your popcorn, you got your soda, like you're cozy, you're feeling comfy, like you're in the present, you're doing your thing. And then you bump into something, right? A memory of unhealed stuff that plays on the screen. And suddenly you get sucked into that film. You get transported, you time travel. And now you're looking at your experience through the lens of your past. And that's where people get stuck. That's where people get looping. And so in EMDR therapy, we're front loading skills to give people the skills that they need to be able to maintain that sense of dual awareness. And so when I think about the eye movements, that's what I'm doing. When I'm doing the reprocessing phases of EMDR therapy, which is honestly very rare, I don't do a lot of that work because I work with a complex population. But when I am doing that work, that's what we're doing is I'm like, okay, I want you to notice, whatever the memory is after we've lit it up. And then I want you to just go with it, see what happens, just kind of let whatever happens, and just go with that, right? And as we do a set, right, they're going back between focusing on the memory and then focusing on me, and then focusing on the memory and then focusing on me, right? And it's my presence, right? That dual awareness of my presence as their psychotherapist, as the person that they've built a relationship with. That's what's the key to making EMDR therapy work. It's not about the eye movements themselves necessarily. There are like YouTube videos of binaural beats, right? That go left, right, left, right, left, right, that you can access and find. There are, I'm sure, videos that will teach you the eye movements. There's a tool of a bouncing dot that goes back and forth, and it's not going to have the same effect as when you're actually sitting in the room and you're being treated with an EMDR therapist, because it's that relationship that you've created and built that helps maintain the dual awareness that you need. Plus, you've been working on the skills. And so there's a little bit of homework, but a lot of the homework is just learning how to adapt, how to cope, how to manage your stress. Lover says, binaural beats make my life complete. Yeah, some people find them really relaxing. Some people find them really chill. People have been doing drum circles as a part of healing since way before 1987. It was not invented. It was not invented by Francine Shapiro, right? There's a wonderful book. It's a heavy one. There's a wonderful book called The Body Keeps the Score, written by Bessel van der Kolk, who's a traumatologist. I think it was published in 2013. So it's not that old. It's about 10 years old now. But that's some of the stuff that he talks about, is how moving the body, rhythm, is so important to facilitate healing. It's a really cool book. One of the things that we're doing when we set up protocols in EMDR therapy is we're doing a lot of preparation work in the beginning of psychotherapy. I use bilateral or dual attention stimulation to do two different things. There's two different tasks I'm trying to accomplish. One is if I'm in the reprocessing phases of EMDR therapy, they're going to be long, rapid sets. And you go for a while, and then you stop, and then you check in, and then you're seeing like, all right, where did your brain go? What are you noticing right now? What's in this moment? And as long as it seems the brain is doing what it's supposed to do, you just keep going, and you just let the brain associate and do what it's got to do. But a lot of the work I'm doing is more in the preparation phases, phase 2 of EMDR therapy, which in my opinion is the golden standard. That's what you really want to be doing in EMDR therapies. You want phase 2. Phases 3 through 7 often get applied inappropriately, too fast. They rush people, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And then people get jaded and people get upset. And I'm hearing some people in the chat talking about having that experience where EMDR therapy was not effective because the readiness was not in place. Your therapist had not adequately probably prepared you because they didn't know how to do it. So phase 2 is what's really important. So in phase 2, when I'm doing the bilateral dual attention, it's slow, short sets. Right? And all we're trying to do is we're trying to take that little smile that someone's experiencing and brighten it, really link it into, really, really work on getting that connection going. That's what's really important for me is, figuring out, okay, well, what form of dual attention is going to work. For some people, they want eye movements. And so you test it together and you say, all right, does that cause any discomfort? That does cause any pain? And so if someone's reporting to me that they're experiencing motion sickness, if they're experiencing any kind of pain, if anything like that's happening in the moment in the room, we're not going to do that. I stop immediately. And any EMDR therapist will do the same. We're trained to look out for that because that's not what we're trying to do. And so if that happens, then we find another method. So if eye movements isn't going to work, we can do tapping. So I sometimes will do that on like the top of somebody's hands where I'll tap back and forth, or I will tap myself and the other person will do the butterfly hug and they'll tap along with me. Or I can do the knees, or we can do sound. So there are beats that you can get and you can change the speed and the flow and you can get the sound going. There are buzzies that you can get. I didn't bring them. There are buzzies that make the buzz, 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 buzz. You can put them in your shoes. For kids, they have, I don't know if you've seen them. They're these like seesaw kind of chairs and you have the kid go back and forth. You could use a freaking slinky, right? What's important is you have the relationship with your therapist and together you figure out what works for you. Everybody's going to have different ways of processing. And if you're someone who's prone to motion sickness and you're having that when you're starting to do eye movements, your therapist is going to find another strategy that works for you. They're going to innovate. They're going to try something different. So if that's a reason that you're not pursuing EMDR therapy, I promise there are so many other strategies that we can do that with. One of the things I will caution is that eye movements can open the door to our trauma. It can start sending us down that pathway. And if we aren't stable, if we don't know what's behind that door, it can actually make us a lot worse. So be careful if you're like experimenting on yourself, if you're doing your own little tappies, like be careful, right? We don't want to get you caught down in that too, because that can happen. The brain is really adept at picking up information and just making these connections real quickly. And so you have to be very careful. I don't advise any of my clients to do tapping. We do it in the room when we're meeting. And that's it. I do it online as well. I will also say that EMDR therapy doesn't have to be in person. EMDR therapy is effective online as well. I have many clients that I do telehealth with. It's just as helpful. We just have to find a different way of doing the dual attention, right? That's an important fact. Advice on cortisol levels, a lot of things that we can do. My card has a couple resources listed. One of the things I will point out, I have a colleague, their name is Dr. Jamie Merich. They are also an EMDR therapist. I've met them at a few different conferences and I've taken some of their trainings and I have some of their books. They're really cool. They are a mental health baddie, let me tell you. And Jamie on their website, traumamadesimple.com, has a whole series of videos that they put up on YouTube. I want to make my own series. I just have to film the content and edit it and post it. But Trauma Made Simple has a whole series of videos on mindful breathing, muscle relaxation, meditation, loving kindness, yoga, so many amazing videos that they have put together. And so I think it's a really good resource to check out. That and the other one I use a lot is Insight Timer. Has a lot of amazing resources as well. It is the only free mindfulness app out there that I've been able to encounter. So I also highly recommend that one as well. Basically, taking care of the body takes care of the mind. Being able to breathe, being able to exercise, being able to sleep. All of those are really important strategies to managing that. Is recent trauma addressed differently from old trauma? Yes. The protocols that we use for a recent traumatic experience are very different than the protocols we use for a long-term memory. What is trauma? Does anybody have a definition of what they think trauma is? We got to talk about trauma if we're going to talk about EMDR therapy, right? Shitty. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good definition. It's shitty stuff. Yep. Anyone else? What else you guys got? What is trauma? Best explanation. It's just shitty. Yes. For me, it's about breaking the cycle of machismo and violence, no matter what it takes. Let's go. Let's go. Something I have from different sources, a memory that has a strong physical negative reaction. Absolutely. Absolutely. What is trauma? Anything that can harm your brain. Emotional damage. That is trauma. You're right. An event that causes lasting adverse effects on individuals functioning from mental, physical, social, emotional, spiritual well-being. Yes. Joe says trauma is just like physical trauma from an old injury. It's reoccurring pain that's still very real, even if dulled. Precisely. So trauma originally comes from the medical world. And they use it in the medical world, right? If you're in a car accident and you have an abrasion on your arm, that's trauma to the body, right? If you fall and you hurt your back, that's a trauma to the body, and they talk about that. And, they have physical therapy and occupational therapy and all sorts of things that we do for the body. Trauma, from a psychological standpoint, is exactly that. It is an unhealed wound from an experience that we went through. I can safely say that most people here wouldn't like me 15 years ago, and honestly, that's what keeps me going and working and being a better person. When you can look back at yourself and you have that feeling of cringe, that feeling of like, man, what was I thinking? Who the hell was I, right? When you've got that going on, that's such an important and healthy sign of growth that you have changed, my friend, that you are not the same person. I don't know. I don't use Facebook as a social media app all that much. I have a Facebook. So if you're like, if I had that, look at my Facebook memories and I look at my posts and I'm like, ew. Ew, Effector. You're so gross. You're so toxic. Why would you say that? That's disgusting, right? That's great. That's such an important part of growth. And I think that's what people get caught on when they get called out, when we challenge them, when we ask them to make a change and they get defensive, is because they're not willing to cringe at their own bullshit. If you can just cringe at your own bullshit, you can just move forward. It's so important. I 180'd in a lot of my personality and behavior my mid to early 20s when I started going to group therapy. A lot of people change a lot in their 20s. Do you know why people change a lot in their 20s? There's a biological reason. In our brain, we have what's called the prefrontal cortex. So here's our brain, okay? So you've got the wrinkly parts, right? Especially where your forehead is. This is called your prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain that is responsible for executive functioning. That's the part of your brain that says, let's think before we do this. Let's develop some skills. Look at the big picture, right? Reasoning. All is located up in our frontal cortex. And that's what makes us different than animals, Inside the brain, in the core of the brain, in the center there, is what's called our limbic system. This is the system that is responsible for being able to process information, right? When someone does a loud sound alert and your body experiences a startle response, like when you're in Emmy stream and somebody does this stupid pipe thing that I don't like, that sensory information signals down into your limbic system, and then your limbic system tells your body what to do, right? To react to that information. Even further down in the brain is what is in our brainstem. That's where our pain receptors are, right? And so those are the things that our brain does that we don't really think about. Our brains develop evolutionarily over time. And that's the part of the brain that develops first when we're little babies. And so your heart, we don't really think about, right? We don't think about our heart. It just kind of does its doki doki thing all on its own. I think there are probably some humans that through decades of Buddhist meditation practice probably can change their heart rate. But for the most part, it just happens on its own. This is the science behind why breathing is such an important coping skill, because breathing is something that is partially regulated by the cerebellum in the brainstem, right? It's kind of an automatic thing. We just kind of breathe. It just does what it needs to do. And we have some executive control over our breath pattern, over what our breathing's going to do. So we can hack our brain a little bit, which is really interesting. So the idea is that your cerebral cortex, we were talking about, finishes its development around 25, 26. And so you think about all of those silly mistakes that we made when we're teenagers, that part of the brain's just not developed. It's just not there. And so when you're saying like, wow, I changed a lot in my 20s, the science confirms, right? Because that's the part of your brain that's now able to help you out and make decisions. Unfortunately, though, that part of your brain may not always be in contact with the limbic system, with the emotion center of the brain. So children that grow up in traumatic environments where they're experience neglect, they experience abuse, if you take a look at the brain scans, you'll see that there's this tissue in the brain called the corpus callosum. It is the membrane that separates the cortex from the limbic system inside. It's also the tissue that separates what's on the left side of the brain with what's on the right side of the brain, right? It's kind of a super highway of interconnection. When we've experienced trauma early in our life, our brain changes, our brain adapts, and that limbic system learns, oh, I need to react. I need to look out, right? I need to train myself to look out for all the bad things, whatever those things might be. And so we get hypersensitive to traumatic information and looking out for it. And so what happens is the tissue shrinks. It gets really small because the brain has adapted to a maladaptive environment. And so you can take a kid who has that experience and throw them in the most happy, loving, healthy place, and it's not going to be quite right because their brain has changed. Every experience we have shapes the brain. The positive thing about that, and one of the reasons I love to be a specific EMDR trauma therapist, is that we can readapt. We can relearn. Daily mindfulness practices like breathing strategies, like I mentioned earlier, can actually show growth in that membrane. That highway can get stronger, meaning the brain can be a better communicator with itself. So we have a little bit more of an ability and executive control to regulate what we're feeling. And there's a difference between what's top-down regulation, which is where we're using the power of thought, right? Our executive system to make decisions that help us cope, and then bottom up, right? We need both strategies to be able to effectively manage those feelings of stress. Being able to do bottom up is about body work, moving your body, taking care of your body, breathing, meditation, right? All of those strategies are really important to hacking the nervous system, hacking what we have in there to induce a calming state. The limbic system, right? That's the part of our brain that's responding to environmental stimuli. And fight and flight, right, are part of that environmental stimuli. It's said that fight goes up and flight goes down. Fight goes up, meaning my body has decided that I need to take care of this problem. There is something in my way. There's a lion coming after me. And the way that I'm going to deal with that situation is I'm going to bulk up my arms and I'm going to fight that thing, whatever that thing is, right? These are instincts that come from our early human hunter-gatherer days. And so we're getting that strength in our body and we're going to fight the bear, Flight goes down, meaning the blood will pool down into your legs because it's strengthening you to get somewhere safe, to get out of the situation, to run away. And so a lot of people, when they're feeling fight, they'll notice the heat in their cheeks, their face will get red because that's where the body's pooling the blood to get the cortisol where it needs to go. When people are feeling more the flight side of things, they'll feel the blood pool drain. They'll feel cold. They might even faint, especially if they have like a blood pressure thing going on. But that's the goal, right? The body's just trying to adjust and survive. And the limbic system's like, we're in danger. We better figure this out. Freeze is a different category. Freeze is the place we go to. So I use this concept called the window of tolerance, right? So there are things in life, stressors that we can go through, that we can experience, that we can manage. Someone cuts me off in traffic. someone's taken too long at the grocery store. Someone shares with me bad news, right? There are things that I can manage within my window of tolerance that are annoying, but I wouldn't necessarily say they're traumatic, right? I can deal with them. Then there are experiences that fall outside that window of what I have the current capacity to manage and to resolve and to deal with, both with internal resources of what I can do for myself and the environment around me, right? Both of those pieces are important factors when it comes to, is this traumatic or not? We need to have those resources to be able to manage those things. And if information and experiences are falling outside that window of tolerance, you've got one of two places you can go. You can go to the place of what's called hyperarousal. So this is the fight or flight, right? Where we experience the panic, we experience the sadness, we experience the anger, we experience like the big experience, whatever it is that's coming through. Whereas other people might go to the other side of that reaction of what's called hypoarousal, the shutdown, the disconnect. The brain is just like, I don't know what to do. And so like Chris is saying, it is kind of like brain lag, right? And so the brain goes to the shutdown mode and it doesn't know what to do. I will also add that there are other options. There are other ways that we respond to the distress that we've learned how to adapt and cope. One of those is to fawn, right? Where we look to the environment. We look to someone to rescue us. We try to get them to help us. Or we go to the people-pleasing mode. That's something I've experienced a lot in my work with people, is noticing these patterns of life where they become overly apologetic. They become overly attuned to other people's wants and needs. And then they're coming to me because they're just so unhappy with their life. They're just so unhappy that their needs aren't being met. And part of it is because that's how they've had to adapt to their trauma. They had to appease an angry parent, a parent that's abusing alcohol, a parent that isn't capable of regulating themselves. And so they've kind of functioned as the adult so early in life that now in their adult relationships, it's just a mess. It's just a mess. And you know, we gotta work through it. That's the concept I think about. It's the window of tolerance. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing with folks is I'm trying to make that window more robust. I'm trying to help people strengthen that window of tolerance. And I don't do that by exposure therapy, right? I don't say, okay, clients, give me the list of your 10 worst life experiences, please. That's bad. That's bad practice. In my therapy practice, if someone's seeking services with me and they go onto my website and they want to request an appointment with me, I collect their contact details and I collect a very basic, like, hey, why are you reaching out to me? Right? That's all I ask for. I don't give clients a clinical information survey of all their history and intake questions because that's needless exposure to the material that's outside their window of tolerance. And I'm actually going to re-traumatize somebody by having them fill that out. Whether they know that or not is another question. It was one of my first discoveries in this career. I worked in substance abuse. And so I did a lot of substance abuse intakes where people would come in and we had to do what's called a biopsychosocial, right? Where we have a history of where are they coming from? What's their family like? What's their social life like? What's their employment history like? What's their substance use like? What's their leisure time like? And all of this is related to figuring out the diagnostics of their substance use disorder and how severe it's gotten, which then informs the treatment plan of what we do to address that. And some people were rapid returners where they would come, they would go to detox and rehab for 30 days. They'd come back to the community, they'd relapse, they'd come back. And we're talking, you know, heroin, bath salts, like all of the things that are really hard to kick. And I would notice that people would come in and they'd go through the biopsychosocial because it's just something you have to do over and over and over again. They kind of get used to it. And there would be like a story that someone is telling me of these awful things that they experience with absolutely no emotion, absolutely no affect. It was as if it was a story of somebody else that they were sharing with me. And what I was observing that I didn't know at the time is they were reliving their trauma and having to shut down to report the history. And they had conditioned themselves to being able to do that so they could access the services. My intake process, I take several sessions, 6 to 8 sessions to do intake, because that's too much information all at once to share to somebody. So I'm really careful about that. Therapy's great. Therapy is about a relationship. That's where healing happens. Healing happens in relationships. And if you don't have a good relationship with your therapist, it's okay. We find a new one. Another cool benefit in getting access to therapy is a lot of employers that you work for have what's called an EAP plan, Employer Assistance Program. Most employers have one, and so that is free therapy that you can access. Usually it's time limited, so you can get about 6 sessions, but you can go see a therapist, for whatever you got going on. You don't need insurance. It doesn't even need to be billable. You don't have to have a diagnosis for that service. But check out your employer's policies on EAPs. That's another hack to getting connected to therapy. I think as a therapist, it is a difficult balance on self-disclosure of what you share and what you don't. And it's different for every client. There are some things, details about my life I will share with a client. And there's a lot of details about my life I won't, because it's never my role to have therapy be about taking care of me. I have a lot of clients that would love to take care of me if given the opportunity, but it's not what the work is about. There are moments about that, where we will talk about it, but for the most part, you've got to be very careful with self-disclosure. But I think, to my earlier point about what it's like to encounter psychotherapy as a person who's experienced marginalization, you need to find a psychotherapist who's comfortable with self-disclosure. If you're a person who's experienced marginalization because you're queer, because you're gay, because you're Black, because you're whatever, fitting under those umbrellas, you're not going to work well with a client or with a therapist who's a blank slate. It's not going to work for you. You need to have somebody who knows their relationship with things and can self-disclose appropriately with you, because that's how you build that bond. EMDR therapy is a 3-pronged approach. It is past, present, and future. We do all of that all at the same time. Some psychotherapies out there, I will call out cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, because those are the two I'm really familiar with. They're more focused on coping skills in the present, right? And just doing your worksheets, doing your handouts, doing your whatever, right? And this is not me saying there's anything wrong with that. I think it's wonderful to have our coping skills and to be working on those things in the present. But EMDR therapy as a whole encompasses this understanding that it's those unhealed things, those wounds, those traumas, right, that shape our perspective of the future. When it comes to trauma, when it comes to PTSD, what's similar feels like it's the same. If you've ever had the experience of imbibing a little bit too much in your 20s or teens with alcohol, and you just have these bad memories about tequila, for example, and anytime you get near tequila or you smell tequila and your body just gives you this gross, icky feeling, and it's no, that's poison. I'm not going to go near that, right? Your brain conditions to these experiences to protect you. It's the same thing with unhealed trauma memories. Someone had asked earlier, is there a difference between a recent trauma and what we do about it and an old school trauma? So I'm going to answer that now. I'm sorry, I totally forgot, but I'm remembering it now and I'm getting to the point. We have 3 months. When a tragic event happens, when some big event goes on, we've got 3 months of lead time where we can do some work with that. That memory is not hard-coded. We can do some movement. We have some things that we can do to process the experience by being around people that care about us, by being able to just have an environment that works well, by using our coping skills, right? When we are able to breathe and process things, we've got 3 months to get through it. If we're in a stressful environment, if we don't have support, if we don't know what to do, if it's world-shaking traumatic stuff that we just can't, right? Then unfortunately, if it lasts past the 3 months, that information gets hard-coded and gets locked in trauma time. And so what the brain does with that experience is just like the tequila, it's going to say, let's say it was a car accident, right? You bashed your car and like it was really scary and really awful, and you didn't really have the opportunity to process that experience, right? Anytime you get in the car, your body's going to freak out. Anytime you drive by the road that you crashed, you're going to have that knee-jerk gross reaction. Sometimes when you're turning on a TV show and there's somebody driving, maybe you have a reaction, right? Any piece of that memory that's unhealed, the image, the feeling, the sensation that you had, the running track belief of the moment, right? All of those pieces have an opportunity to link into the unhealed raw traumatic information. And then body and brain are going to do what they need to do to defend against that. And so that's where the avoidance comes in when it comes to PTSD and trauma, right? Is we're avoiding those things that are outside the window of tolerance of what we can manage. And so we have this idea in EMDR therapy that it's that unhealed stuff. That's what's causing our symptoms. When we represent, unless it's an organic condition, depression does have some organic elements to it, and, changing our body chemistry like medication, diet, exercise has an impact on those symptoms. However, many mental health symptoms that we experience, we believe if they're not organically caused as EMDR therapists, it is the result of unprocessed traumatic information. It's stuck in the brain. We didn't have the tools to get through it at the time. We don't know what to do about it now. And so we've just kind of, swept it under the rug and tried to pretend it didn't exist or happen until we bump into something similar, right? We smell the smell. We see the thing. We have an experience that leads to a sensation or feeling that's familiar to that unhealed wound. And now that whole memory network can light up. And the farther and farther we get away from the event, the more fragmented that experience becomes. And so a lot of people, by the time they get to me, I just have panic attacks for no reason. I just get really depressed. I have no idea why. It's always a reason. It's always a reason. And 80% of the time, it's trauma. It's unhealed trauma. It's these wounds. It's these experiences. And you don't have to have PTSD to have unhealed wounds that you could benefit getting healed through something like EMDR therapy. So that's part of the work when we're working with somebody in EMDR therapy, is we're trying to figure out and identify what are those formative experiences? What are those things in the past that are coloring how they look at the present, how they look at the present experiences. And we work on the present, right? We work to desensitize the triggers. We work to stabilize. We do all of the things that we need to do to help a person live a better life in their present. And when we heal the past, we can look better for the future because we can believe something about ourselves. Instead of believing I'm not enough, I can believe when I think about that old memory once I've healed, I'm exactly what I need. I'm a very strong person. I figured it out. Whatever it is, right? Whatever those natural positive insights are that we activate through the healing process, right? And that can really shape our future. So we work on the past, the present, and the future all at the same time. And in that way, it's a very encompassing psychotherapy. EMDR therapy is not just about reprocessing our triggers. It is about understanding where our stuff comes from, being able to manage and handle it, and get to a place where our brain can do what it needs to do to heal. I say this at the end of every one of my streams. If you've been around, you've heard me say it. With the right conditions, every human being has the capability of healing, and you have the power to create those conditions in your life. And I believe that. And that's an EMDR therapy philosophy. That is part of why I do what I do. And I love doing it because I've seen it. I've seen the healing, and it's not linear. Progress is a challenge sometimes. But it's really cool to watch in the room to see people grow and change. It's really neat. It's really neat. So we look at the past, the present, and the future in EMDR therapy. So EMDR has some underpinnings from a lot of other psychotherapies. So when we look at one of the earliest forms of psychotherapy. Think about Sigmund Freud. This is psychodynamic psychoanalysis. This is from like the 1890s. He had this drive theory that was pretty silly. The id, the ego, the superego. But some of the traits of psychoanalysis that are in EMDR therapy, we do a little bit of free association, the idea of catharsis, abreaction, thinking about our symbols, right? Thinking about the family of origin, how that impacts things. There's a lot. And Francine Shapiro, she was psychodynamically trained because that was the primary modality. That's what most social workers, most psychologists in the 90s and 80s were trained to do, because that's what they learned. That was what was the modality of choice, was psychodynamic therapy. In the 50s, we had Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, who started working on our cognitive therapies, right? So in EMDR therapy, we look at these beliefs. That's an important component of what we're addressing, is these negative cognitions from the past that are shaping our view of the present and the future, and working to shift that, right? Very similar to what people will do in cognitive therapy. Skinner, who's the behavioral therapy guy there, he was around in the 30s and the 40s. And that was about the same time that World War II veterans were coming back. And they didn't know what to do, right? They didn't really probably have a definition for PTSD yet. It was shell shock, right? It was a shameful thing. And so they needed to develop a short-term therapy to try to manage depression, to try to manage anxiety. And so that's the origins of where the cognitive behavioral therapy method came from. It was the work of Ellis, Skinner, and Beck, right? The three of them put together their research, and that's where we got cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Where thoughts, emotions, and actions are all connected, and we can work on connecting those. There's a lot of experiential therapy that we have in EMDR therapy. So that's where, Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, a lot of the work that they did around that, about being able to really just have those experiences of what those emotions are, was an important component of what we do in EMDR therapy. Same with the body sensations. There's somatic therapy out there. That's another form of psychotherapy. That was started by William Reich back in 1933. Hypnosis has been around since the 1840s. That's Franz Anton Mesmer there in that picture. And then systems theory, right? That came from a biologist, Ludwig van Bertalanffy, in the 40s and the 50s, right? So EMDR therapy is an integration of all of these other works. But again, if you notice, they're all white men, every single one of them. And so to me, that's another reason why I like being an EMDR therapist, is it's a therapy created by a woman. I think that's important. We need to think outside the box, and you have to have a little bit of a different experience. And when she reported her findings, when she first started doing the eye movement protocols for EMD, they thought she was crazy. They thought she was nuts. They're like, there's no way eye movements is going to do anything that's going to help a person. And so these people tried to discredit her by repeating her protocols. And luckily, they kept replicating the same treatment effects. They're like, oh, shit. They didn't believe her. They thought she was nuts when she came out with this in the 80s and the 90s. They didn't think it was real. But there's been at least 26 randomized controlled trials that demonstrate with impurities that it's an amazing psychotherapy that works. So we talked about trauma, big T versus small t. So big T trauma is like major life-shattering events. If you look in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual from the APA, it's things like sexual assault, actual or threatened death, right? Those big, like, life-shattering experiences that we go through, those are considered big T traumas. So small T trauma, I just want to clarify, those are those little slights, those little moments that we experience. And a lot of people I work with, typically, they might have a big T in their history, but that's often not what's contributing to the dysfunction. It's the peppering of small T's throughout the lifespan that gets them caught up because they chain together. Small T's are something like, mom doesn't pick me up at the softball game, and now I'm left embarrassed and alone. Nobody wants me to be on their team at gym class. Is there something wrong with me? This person doesn't answer the phone when I call them anymore. Do they not like me, right? Those little small T's get peppered throughout the lifespan, and that's often what I see presenting in needing treatment is how do we get through some of those things that have shaped our worldview, our self-esteem, how we see ourselves. And I do a lot of work on uncovering that attachment work with folks, especially since I work with a lot of LGBT folks, right? We experience any form of marginalization, right? You experience small T's every day of your life. I will clarify that small T's are also different when we're young, right? When we experience things at an early age, what's terrifying to a toddler is not going to be what's terrifying to an adult, but it doesn't mean it's not going to have an impact, right? And so a lot of times we will discredit our own experience. We will minimize our wounding because we have a cluster of small T's that we think, well, it's not as bad as someone else. I wasn't this didn't happen to me. But I'm telling you, those small T experiences are just as foundational to our personality development and just as warranted for treatment as the big T's. You don't need PTSD to benefit from psychotherapy. So big trauma is that unhealed material, right? The past is present. That trauma gets locked in trauma time. There's the image, the sensations, the feelings, the sounds, the meanings, all of it kind of gets clustered. The idea of processing these experiences in EMDR therapy is we let go of those emotions and sensations. I don't need to remember the fright in my heart of that car, right, running into in the winter time, about to hit the deer, if I've processed, because I'm aware that I'm not in danger right now, right? I'm okay. I'm here in my house, right? But when that information's not healed, right? We time travel, we go back and we start feeling the panic. We start feeling the anxiety when we get behind the wheel if it's unhealed, right? And so the idea is that once we've healed, once we've gotten to the other side of it, we can remember the car accident, right? When we go through EMDR therapy, we can remember the different facts about it, but we let go. We let go of all of that old information we don't need. We change. We really do. Joe says, I definitely have small T's from the past, but I just realized this relates to why I mentioned I needed that laugh earlier. Because the small T's from recently have added up. They add up, and they have just as much of an impact as the big T. The DSM doesn't count them. You can't have PTSD according to the diagnostic criteria if it isn't a big T, which I think is bullshit. I think that's untrue. I've found that those relational traumas contribute so much more to the unhealed presentations I get in my office compared to the big T stuff. They add up. What are we doing in EMDR therapy? Here's the things that I do. This is what I do every day. I teach skills. I teach coping skills. I validate skills. I do a lot of DBT skills, right? Whatever the hell is going to work, whatever somebody needs to help them manage and learn how to regulate their emotions, that's what I'm going to teach. That's what I do a lot of in my work of preparation with folks, is giving them coping skills. So that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is just teaching those coping skills and helping people regulate and process what happens in the moment, the stress du jour, but ultimately give people what they need so they can really build that window of tolerance we talked about, so they can manage things. And I often do that by focusing on the positive. When someone comes in, I'm going to ask them about their weekend. When I see that light of like a thing that they're excited for, I'm going to ask them to tell me more about it. And if I'm really, really confident, I might ask them to tell me how they feel about it. That's when I ask that question. I don't ask that question typically when someone's experiencing a negative emotion. Usually I might clarify, it sounds like you're getting upset. Let's talk about it, right? But when someone's feeling something good, when someone's noticing something that's lighting up, that's making them happy, excited, joyful, whatever it might be, I want them to notice that. I want them to pay attention to that. And I want them to really effectively build that muscle to manage to handle that piece, because that's going to prepare them for the work. If you can handle feeling good about yourself, then you can handle your trauma. You can handle your trauma any day. You can handle anything the world throws at you if you can feel good. That's where I start, is I teach that. I teach that. I teach that there's a difference between feeling calm, stepping into that relaxed sensation, and shutting down. We know how to shut down. We know how to turn it off. A lot of people learn how to adapt that way. We don't know how to feel calm. What is that? I teach that skill. When I'm doing history with folks, I'm working to identify the events that, kind of have shaped that present view of where they're at, where they're coming from. I take a lot of notes that I may not ask clients about, that I will talk to them later once we've done more preparation, when I feel more confident that I'm not going to poke information outside that window of tolerance. And then, at some point, we may choose to digest that maladaptive information, reprocess it. The goal of EMDR therapy is so that someone can have the contentment in their life that they desire. That's all. That's all we're doing. We're not just reducing symptoms. It's a full psychotherapy that leads to improving the ability to love, to bond, and to excel. That's words right out of Shapiro's book. EMDR therapy is an amazing, amazing psychotherapy. It is innovative. I like to think about, when I'm thinking about like teaching skills and preparing for healing, is we want a buffet. We want a buffet of options, choices, different seasons, different hats. You need a whole ass buffet to be able to select from. Having one or two skills that work is good, but that's not enough for me. I refuse to take someone into the reprocessing phases of EMDR therapy if we're both not confident that there's a buffet, there's a menu of choices of what people know how to use that works for them, that keeps them out of disturbance. Like I said, that's the only homework I'm giving in EMDR therapy. Stay out of the disturbance. You save the hard work for our time together. We will do that. We will handle that. I will do what I need to do to keep you within your window of tolerance when you're with me. But that's what we do, is we have a buffet, and I try to see what works. And sometimes tools I like, they don't work. And that's okay. I throw it out. We go to the next one, right? But the whole goal is you need that buffet of tools. You do. So in EMDR therapy, that's what we call it, is the adaptive information processing. That is what we're trying to do. That is what is really unique about EMDR therapy compared to other psychotherapies out there. It's the AIP. So when you get a cut, when you get a wound, I've got one on my fingy right now. I went hiking and I got brave, and I was trying to get into the water to get a cool picture, and I fell on my booty. And I scraped my finger. I don't know if you saw the post on Twitter of me falling on my butt. I scraped my finger. It hurt, but it's healing. It's getting better. It's going to be fine, right? Our body knows how to heal. So does our brain. When it comes to this stuff about trauma, these adaptations, these things that we've learned, the brain also knows how to heal when we are in the right conditions, when we're in an environment that is supportive and affirming, when we have the strength and skills and confidence that we know how to manage things, when all that's in place, the brain heals. I do very little heavy lifting when I'm doing reprocessing work with folks, because I've done the work. I front-loaded all the things that they need so that the conditions are right so that their brain can heal. It's a hard journey getting to that point. I will say that. And everyone's got a different experience with it. But that's a philosophy that I believe that we all have the capacity to grow and heal and change. The brain just knows what to do. Dual attention stimulant, bilateral stimulation. So we talked about that today, the DAS. It's all about being able to have one foot in the past and one foot in the present. Being able to look at the memory, recognize that it's a memory, and keep the orientation to who you are in the present. So you know how we were talking about being able to cringe about our past? That's the same idea, right? When you're seeing things about yourself that you feel bad about, of who you were, what you used to be like, you got to remember that that's not you. The conditions where that was how you adapted and dealt with life are not the conditions of today. And that's especially true when it comes to these unhealed experiences from our childhood. We have very little control over our environment when we're children, when we're teens. There's not a lot we can do. But as grown-ass adults, we have a fully developed brain. We got adult money. Well, sometimes. I guess it depends on our economic situation, right? But there is so much freedom, so much more choice. That buffet is so much more bountiful of what we can do as an adult. compared to when we experience these events that are unhealed in the beginning. And it's important to have that orientation and be able to vibe with that. So I want us to take a look at my cart, and I definitely want to add more resources. I think it needs some more things to it. But yeah, if you scroll down further on my card, you'll see here finding a therapist and other resources. I've got crisis resources, finding a therapist, some coping strategies, education, and streamer support. I've got at the top of the page our crisis resources here. So one of the cool things in the United States, if you dial 988, if you're in a crisis at any point in the United States, you can just call that and you'll get your local help crisis line, which is really cool. SAMHSA's got a helpline. There's the Trevor Project. There's the Trans Lifeline. I've raised money for them before. They're an amazing org. They're an org led by trans folk for trans folk, and they help a lot. So like, if you're someone who wants gender inclusive care, if you're somebody who needs some money for your, a binder, if you want to try that out and you can't afford it, they have amazing resources and grants there. I had someone suggest to me the International Association for Suicide Prevention. There is a ton of great information on this website. I don't know if you guys have ever been over here. Highly recommend checking out their resources page. Tons of stuff in terms of like, if you've got a friend or something who's going through a crisis, it's really, really helpful. You get crisis lines from all over, what to do, what to say, ask questions that you can go through if you're ever curious about it. I like that link a lot. There's a lot of information packed in the resources of that particular page. There's some links here on finding a therapist. Therapy Den's a really cool mental health directory. They're very inclusive. I don't know if you guys know Therapy Jeff on TikTok, but this is his organization. But this is a really cool, inclusive listing of therapists, and you can sort by a lot of different things: insurance, out of pocket. Therapy Den's really cool. I like their mission. I like their org. I like them a lot. Psych Today is kind of like the standard directory of psychotherapists. A lot of people will use Psych Today to list their practices. There's a lot of people on there. But the nice thing is you'll get the telehealth listings. So this is kind of like the default most therapists are on. You can find them here. So a lot of people to sort through. But if you email 10 people, one of them might respond back. We mentioned today the Open Path Collective. Like I said, you spend $40 for a session. It's a lot cheaper to get access to psychotherapy, tons of therapists. And remember, if somebody is licensed in your state, they can see you by telehealth. It's amazing. I love that option. I'm licensed in New York and Florida, so I can see people from either state. It's kind of cool. If you are interested more in EMDR therapy specifically, EMDRIA has an international association, and you can find a therapist anywhere in the world on this thing. They're amazing. There's a lot of information about EMDR therapy just in general. If you're curious about it, feel free to check out their website. They have a lot of good content. But yeah, you'll find lots of therapists, and you can sort typically any of these directories. You can sort by insurance plan, modality. Some of them, I just signed up for a new insurance program myself, and they allowed me to put sexuality and gender and like all of those pieces of marginalization, so you can better match with someone who might be a better fit for you, which I think is cool. I hear ads about BetterHelp. How do we feel about that? BetterHelp. That's what I say. BetterHelp. They mistreat their therapists. They underpay them. They hire unqualified professionals. They steal your personal health information and then sell it. And then they don't provide adequate care. BetterHelp. That's what I say. I said what I said. If you didn't know that, now you do. Sorry. I got angry. They dominate the market. They have so much money. They're a venture capitalist thing. It's the evil corporation of mental health. They're just trying to make money. Yes. Yes. They are a monster. They are a monster that needs to die. They email me all the time. They send me requests on LinkedIn all the time. They're so aggressive. I seriously hear ads from them on every spot. I know. And the problem is those people on the podcast, they don't know. They don't understand what they're endorsing is a terrible, abusive program that takes advantage of people and doesn't give them what they need. I feel bad because I'm sure there are people out there who have benefited from working with BetterHelp. I'm sure there are people that have had connections there, that have had some healed experiences, and I'm not trying to shame anybody for having those experiences. Like, your experience is yours, that's great, but they take advantage. And I don't stand for that. I don't know anybody who understands how they work who will stand for that. They're awful. They're an awful company. Inclusive Therapist is another website that I would recommend. So again, like I said, if you're a person who's experienced marginalization, you don't necessarily have to match with someone who matches your identity, but an inclusive therapist is going to understand the importance of self-disclosure in psychotherapy. And they're going to be able to be a little more comfortable about it and be able to do something. As you can see, I want someone who has cultural knowledge. I want someone with a specific language. I need someone with certain office facilities, right? They think about all of those things in their listings, and they make sure that they do that because you matter. I love their website. I love their tools to find folks. Latinx therapy is a directory. There's South Asian therapists. There's the International Therapist Directory. And I could put more and more on my card if I wanted to. There's tons of them out there if you just do a little bit of Googling yourself. But I just want to throw that out there, that there's so many cool directories out there. If you're looking for a therapist and the one that you're going through isn't giving the results you want, try another one. There's a lot of people out there in the field. You just got to find them. And not everyone in private practice is good at marketing their practice. I'm included in that. I'm not great at it. The two that I always recommend to folks, and we talked about this earlier, Trauma Made Simple is my colleague, Dr. Jamie Marich. They are an amazing EMDR therapist. They're also an advocate for mental health. They are open about their experiences as a lived person with recovery. They are a lived person about their mental health with dissociation and identity as a plural person. And a lot of people in the field don't like that. And I think they're a badass. Dr. Jamie is a badass. I've got to meet them many times. I got them to sign one of my books. They're kind of one of my therapy heroes. I will admit it. I have a little bit of a parasocial like of this person. We got to go to the EMDR conference that was in DC in the fall. And we had a meetup of LGBT EMDR therapists, which was amazing. And Dr. Jamie was there. And one of the things we got to comment about is on the conference app, there was a forum and there was a group of Christian EMDR therapists and getting together and basically talking about conversion therapy. And Dr. Jamie was like, no. And she went out and asked some questions and it was great. It was so great. So they're an amazing human just in general. I love Dr. Jamie. Their books are really good, but Trauma Made Simple is their website, all about free resources related to EMDR, therapy, healing, all of that stuff. So please, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, do. This particular tab that I have linked is the Mindful Living Coping Skills series that put them on the map on YouTube. So you'll find different breathing videos, muscle relaxation, all of the things related to, remember we were talking about top-down processing and bottom-up? These are really good concrete bottom-up skills that I think would be really helpful for anybody. They also have a yoga series if you're into that. Please feel free to get a look. And there's other resources as well. If you're interested in what the hell does an EMDR therapy session look like, everyone's going to have a different style. Every therapist is a little different. But Dr. Jamie has some videos that they've done. If you want to see what the 8-phase protocol looks like, you can go check that out. They have it listed on their website, which is kind of cool. Insight Timer is another plug I want to give as a resource. This is a free app. It's the only free one out there of sleep, anxiety, and stress management. There are exercises, mindfulness resources. It is amazing. I use this tool. I need to get better at using it every day. Feel free to download this. All the other ones cost money, and there are paid features of this app. I think there's classes that you can take and things like that. But as far as I can tell, this is a free app. It is amazing. I love it. I use it, and I highly recommend it. And then in terms of education, here's just some information about mental health, just some general stuff. Take this as a cool org. A lot of people in this raid train link to this because there's just an abundance of resources and materials on their website. If you are a streamer and you're ever having a conversation about mental health, this is a great one to have as part of your help command or find a therapist command, whatever command you choose to use. Definitely consider adding that as a resource. NAMI's great. I've got the TTRPG safety toolkit on here. If you're interested about utilizing safety tools in tabletop gaming, we talked about that in my podcast. Had some amazing guest stars for that, so feel free to go check them out. Oh yeah, and we did a talk a while ago about burnout and managing burnout. So if you're interested in that talk, I need to get it uploaded to my podcast, but there's some information there. And then we also have the RTS bot from Guardians Mental Health. Real-time support. So you can add that if you're a streamer and you want to have a bot that can give resources out and stuff in your stream live in the moment that anyone can use at any time. RTS is great. Guardians Mental Health are amazing. They are doing their own mental health stuff this month. They're a pretty cool organization. They're a nonprofit. And they're local to me, which is really cool. I had a good chat with the CEO when I went to PAX. He's a cool guy. He's a really cool guy. His name's Joe. He's nice. NAMI's great to partner with. I agree. I love NAMI. I have a lot of admiration for my local chapter. They're awesome. I have Guardians bookmarked ever since you brought that up in a VC. Good. Yeah, Guardians are great. So that's my card. That's what's on the Find a Therapist page. And I'm adding things as time goes. Obviously, all my socials and stuff are linked there. But my primary reason for having my card is I want people to have these resources. If you are a streamer, if you run a community, if you're a mod, if you're whatever on this Twitch space, if there's anything on my card resource-wise that you see that you like, steal it. Copy paste it. You don't need to credit me. Whatever's on here, if you like it and you want to add it to your whatever information, you want to add it as a command, I don't care. Steal it. If you want to just link to my card, you can do that too. I don't care. But please steal these resources. Don't gatekeep them. Use them. Give people what they need. I think it's really helpful. If you guys don't know Ari, she is an amazing streamer and a wonderful advocate for mental health. She coordinates this raid train every year. This is the third time that she's run this particular event. This is my second time participating, and I'm so happy to be here and a part of this amazing community on Twitch. I've met so many cool people through this raid train, and I can't wait to continue to make friends. And, I love surrounding myself with people who like to talk about these topics because they're hard. It's so hard. We're here to have jokes and have fun. And, a lot of people use Twitch to escape and, do their things, but we're still human. We still have our needs. And I am trying to figure out a plan. There's a couple organizations out there that I'm trying to consider if I'm going to partner with or not. But one of the things that I would love to see happen out there is a program for people to have access to real-time video conversations, consultation of like, okay, somebody just popped in your chat and they just said this. What do you do? Give people like some actual live coaching advice, whether it's just demonstration videos or role plays or whatever, right? I would love to be part of creating some space where we can better adequately manage when someone's having a mental health crisis and approach them with compassion, with care, rather than like freaking out with anxiety and not knowing what to do and actually causing more harm. Because I've seen that happen on this platform. I know of a woman who has been experiencing silencing on this platform who was having some mental health stuff come up. And it's terrible to see it happening. And like, they weren't my communities, so there's not much I can do about it. I can only manage my space the way I manage it. I would love to see more confidence in mods, in streamers, in community leaders, in just general chat people to be able to know, like, how do we see signs of mental health problems and what do we do about it to more adequately be compassionate and just empathetic, wonderful humans. If anybody has any questions about what I talked about, you're always welcome to send me a DM. I may not respond to them immediately because life be lifing. But if anyone has questions about mental health, therapy, whatever, reach out. Reach out. The least I can say is like, oh, I don't know about that. Here, let me point you in another direction. I said it earlier. I'll say it again. And I continue to say it at every stream. With the right conditions, every single human being has the capability of healing, and you do have the power to create those conditions for yourself. Don't forget that. Hopefully today's talk was helpful. You know, whether you lurked, whether you hung out, whether you're listening to this later on the road on a podcast, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be part of this community on Twitch. And I will see you all next week, if not in the raid train. Bye, everybody. Thank you all for joining for yet another episode of Roll for Resilience. I'm Effector of Change. You can find me streaming on Twitch at twitch.tv/effectorofchange. And if you'd like to support my work, feel free to drop me a coffee at ko-fi.com/effectorofchange.